We talked this summer on Market Journal about how producers can use cover crops as a forage option. But if you're going to do that, Nebraska Extension weed management educator Chris Proctor says you must be aware of herbicide label rotation restrictions from the previous corn and soybean crops because of the potential risks to grazing animals. We talked with Chris recently at UNL's Havelock Farm on the northeast corner of Lincoln and started by discussing plant-back restrictions.
So certainly thinking about plant-back restrictions, we're thinking about how long an herbicide is in the soil, how long it sticks around, and how that might affect the next crop you're trying to plant. So it could affect any crop. So if you're going from corn to soybeans, there's certain herbicides that have a long enough residual that you wouldn't want to plant soybeans after, or you wouldn't want to use that herbicide because it would affect your soybeans. So thinking about cover crops, it's that same idea, but we're trying to crowd that timing even a little bit closer. So if you want to put it right after your corn crop, you got to think about that herbicide you use in the spring. How long is that residual, and is it going to affect that cover crop that I'm putting down?
Can you describe how it could affect the crop, what actually happens in the plant there?
Sure. Different crops are going to have different levels of sensitivity to an herbicide, and different herbicides are going to affect crops differently. But if it's a soil residual herbicide, usually it'll probably prevent your crop from coming up. So a lot of times you might just have reduced emergence of your cover crop, or it might not come up at all, and so it might look like just a crop failure.
We've talked this year about producers using cover crops not necessarily for cover, but for cover and grazing purposes. Is there anything to keep in mind there?
Absolutely. So that's one of the things we talk about quite a bit, is if you really want to get the maximum benefit out of your cover crop, if you can graze it, that's an ideal situation. But when you think about cover crops and grazing, suddenly herbicide restrictions become extremely important. So we always talk about following the label, and we're thinking about herbicides and label restrictions. Using cover crops for grazing, we absolutely have to follow the label restrictions.
When you're talking about grazing and using a spray, not necessarily on that crop, but the previous crop, can you go more into the restrictions there?
Yeah, so one thing, a really important distinction to make when you're thinking about grazing restrictions on a label is that restriction only applies to the crop to which the herbicide was sprayed. So if you're talking about an herbicide sprayed to a corn crop, the grazing restriction on the label, so those 30, 45-day grazing restrictions, that's only applying to that corn crop. So you have to wait 45 days before you can graze your corn. That doesn't apply to the cover crop because the herbicide wasn't applied to the cover crop. So now you have to use a rotation restriction as opposed to a grazing restriction for the cover crop. And that's a really important distinction to make.
So that means you can graze it then within that 45 days?
You can graze the corn because the corn was sprayed. You cannot graze the cover crop. It would be a separate restriction that you'd have to follow, and typically it's going to be longer.
How do you develop a weed program or a weed management program here that allows you to try and encompass all of your needs?
So when you're thinking about the weed program, and you have to take into account all the crops that you want to incorporate in your system, I think is number one. So you got to think out ahead a little bit, and so trying to use herbicides. And there's some herbicides that are going to be more forgiving to those shorter rotation restrictions. And we actually have a NEB guide that we published recently talking about some of the rotation restrictions, some herbicide options that have a short enough window that you could rotate 2 cover crops and still be able to graze some of those cover crops.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to that NEB guide Chris mentioned if you're interested in learning more about this issue.